The first thing I noticed about the Holloway Ranch was the fence. Not because it was broken, though it was in 11 places I counted before I stopped counting, but because someone had tried to fix it. Recently. The wire was new in spots, bright against the rusted older strands, and the posts had been reseated with rocks packed tight around their bases. Whoever did it knew approximately what they were doing, which is a different thing entirely from knowing how to do it. The tension was wrong. The spacing was optimistic. A determined calf could have walked through most of it without breaking stride. I pulled my horse up and sat there for a minute studying it. I have this habit, Arlene, my sister, called it my surveying disease, where I can't pass a piece of broken infrastructure without mentally cataloging what it would take to fix it. Fence like this. 2 days, $40 in materials, a post hole digger, and someone who understood that wire fencing is an argument between tension and give, and you have to let the give win more often than your pride wants. I wrote it down in my ledger, not as a debt, just as a thing I noticed. I'd been writing down things I noticed for 6 years, ever since a Comanche woman outside Fort Griffin told me that a man who doesn't record his observations is a man living the same day repeatedly. She'd said it in a tone that suggested she was describing me specifically, and she was right, and I'd bought the ledger the next morning. The ranch house sat about 200 yards from the road, if you could call it a road. More of a suggestion. The house itself was, well, it was standing, which in that part of the Arizona territory was its own kind of accomplishment. Single story, adobe and timber, with a porch that sagged on the left side like a man favoring a bad knee. Smoke came from the chimney, thin and white, the kind that says someone's burning good dry wood and not much of it. A girl appeared on the porch. She was maybe 7, 8 years old, with hair the color of old rope, and a face that hadn't decided yet whether to be suspicious or curious. She had a broom in her hands, held across her body like a rifle, and she watched me with the kind of focus I'd seen in border dogs, not aggressive, but deeply unwilling to be surprised. "Ma," she said without turning around, not loud, just a statement directed at the dark rectangle of the doorway behind her. I raised one hand, palm out. Universal gesture. I mean no harm, or at least I don't mean harm right now, which is the most honest version of that promise anyone can make. The woman who appeared in the doorway was not what I expected, though I couldn't have told you what I expected. She was tall, nearly my height, with dark hair pulled back so tight it looked painful, and hands that were red and rough in the way that means lye soap and too much washing. She was maybe 28, maybe 32. There's an age range where hard living makes the math impossible. Her dress was patched at both elbows and the hem, neatly, precisely, the kind of patching that says I will not be undone by fabric. She didn't speak, just stood there with one hand on her daughter's shoulder, waiting. "Ma'am," I said. I took my hat off because my mother raised me to do that, and because I've found that a man holding his hat is a man who's asking permission to exist in your space, and that asking matters. "My name is Eli Brandt. I'm looking for work between here and Prescott, and I was told in town that your ranch might need." "Who told you that?" Her voice was flat, not hostile. Just flat, the way a surface is flat when everything that was growing on it has been scraped away. "Man at the feed store. Graying fellow, missing the tip of his right index finger. Hector Medina." He didn't give his name, just pointed this direction and said you might need a hand with some repairs. Something moved across her face. It happened fast, a tightening around the eyes, a small compression of the mouth, and then it was gone, replaced by the flatness again. I recognized the expression because I'd worn it myself. It was the look of someone who'd been talked about and who knew exactly what was being said and who resented the accuracy of it. "I don't have money to pay anyone," she said. "I'm not expensive." I said I don't have money. "I heard you, I'm also not proud. If you've got a barn I can sleep in and food you can spare, I'll work for that." The girl looked up at her mother. The mother looked at me. I stood there holding my hat, feeling the sun on the back of my neck, aware that I was being measured against some internal standard I couldn't see. "The barn leaks," she said finally. "Then I'll fix the barn first." She didn't smile, but something in her posture shifted, not relaxation exactly, more like a redistribution of weight, the way you adjust when you accept that a load isn't going to get lighter. "Supper's at 6, she said. "The well's out back, don't come inside without knocking." She turned and went back through the doorway. The girl stayed on the porch for another 3 seconds, studying me with that border dog focus, then followed her mother inside. I put my hat back on and led my horse toward the barn. The barn was worse than the fence. I spent the first afternoon just cataloging what needed doing, and the list filled an entire page of my ledger. Roof, missing shingles in the southeast quadrant, 3 rafters showing rot, the ridge beam sagging in the middle with a tiredness that suggested it had been sagging for years and was only waiting for permission to give up entirely. Walls, gaps in the siding wide enough to put my fist through. Floor, packed earth mostly, with old straw that had turned to something between mulch and regret. 1 stall door hung by a single hinge. The other stall door was gone entirely, repurposed. I found it later, nailed over a window in the house where the glass had broken. I started with the roof because rain was coming. I could smell it, that particular metallic sweetness that precedes storms in the desert, a scent I've never been able to adequately describe in my ledger despite trying 4 separate times. I was up on the roof, pulling rotted shingles when I saw them. 2 figures coming from the east along the tree line where the creek ran. They moved with a particular kind of ease, unhurried, deliberate, the gait of people who knew exactly where they were going and felt no need to rush. An older man and a younger woman, both Apache. I stopped what I was doing and watched, not out of alarm but out of that surveying habit. The man carried something, a bundle wrapped in cloth. The woman carried a basket. They walked directly to the house, and the girl, I still didn't know her name, ran out to meet them with the first expression I'd seen on her face that wasn't suspicion. It was joy. Uncomplicated, full-body joy, the kind that children haven't yet learned to moderate. The older man knelt and let the girl crash into him, absorbing the impact with a slight rock backward and a sound that might have been a laugh. The younger woman went inside, and I heard voices, Clara's low, flat tone and this new woman's voice, which was warmer, more musical, carrying a rhythm I couldn't quite parse from this distance. I went back to pulling shingles. Whatever this was, it wasn't mine to watch. At supper, Clara introduced them. The older man was Nanton. The younger woman was his daughter, Lozen, named, I learned later, after the warrior woman, though this Lozen carried a healer's knowledge rather than a fighter's weapons. They lived about 4 miles east, in a small settlement near the creek's source, and they had been coming to the Holloway Ranch every week for 2 years. "Since James died," Clara said, and the flatness in her voice developed an edge, like a blade someone had sharpened without meaning to. James was her husband. I gathered this the way you gather most information in places like this, through silences and implications, through the shape of what people don't say. Nanton ate quietly, watching me with eyes that were not unfriendly but were deeply, fundamentally patient. The patience of someone who has learned that most things reveal themselves in time, and that rushing the revelation only distorts it. He was perhaps 60, perhaps older. His hands were large and scarred, and he held his fork with a delicate precision that seemed almost humorous against the roughness of the rest of him. Lozen spoke to the girl, whose name, I finally learned, was me, in a mixture of English and Endi that I couldn't follow, but that made me laugh. The sound was startling in that house. It bounced off the walls like it didn't know where to land. "Mr. Brandt is fixing the barn," Clara said to no one in particular. Nanton looked at me. "The barn has needed fixing for some time." "Yes, sir, it has. James always said he'd get to it next month." A pause. There were many next months. Clara's jaw tightened. She didn't look up from her plate. I recognized this too. The way the dead become both sacred and irritating. How grief braids together with frustration until you can't pull them apart. Until loving someone's memory and resenting their failures become the same gesture. "The roof's the worst of it," I said, because someone had to move the conversation onto solid ground. "I can have it patched before the rain. The walls will take longer." "You're staying then?" Nanton said. It wasn't a question. "If Mrs. Holloway will have me." Clara still didn't look up. "He's working for meals and a place to sleep," she said, as if clarifying the terms of a contract she hadn't entirely agreed to. Nanton nodded slowly. He looked at me again with those patient eyes, and I had the uncomfortable sensation of being read like a page in someone else's ledger. After supper, I helped clear the dishes while Clara put me to bed. Lozen washed and I dried, and she studied me with an openness that was the opposite of Nanton's patient waiting. She was simply curious. "You keep a book," she said, nodding toward the ledger visible in my vest pocket. "I write things down." "What things?" Debts, observations, things I need to remember. Most men I've met are trying to forget. I dried a plate and set it on the shelf. Forgetting is how you end up owing things you don't realize you owe. She tilted her head, considering this. My father says something similar. He says that a man who doesn't know his debts is a man who doesn't know himself. Your father sounds like a man I should listen to. He is, most people don't. We finished the dishes in a comfortable silence. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall, ticking against the windows like someone counting. I fixed the roof in 3 days. It should have taken 2, but on the second day I found that the rot in the rafters was deeper than I'd thought, isn't it always? And I had to ride into town for lumber. The ride gave me time to think, which is both the blessing and the curse of working alone in open country. A horse doesn't interrupt your thoughts. A horse doesn't tell you that the thing you're turning over in your mind is something you should set down. What I was turning over was Clara. Not in the way you might think, or not only in that way. She was a striking woman, yes, but what struck me wasn't her appearance. It was her discipline. The way she ran that ranch with a precision that bordered on fury. She was up before dawn, feeding the chickens. She had 11, and she called them by name, and every name was a saint, which I found privately hilarious and publicly kept to myself. She mended fences. She hauled water. She kept the house so clean you could have performed surgery on the kitchen table. And I suspect she cleaned it that thoroughly specifically because she could control it. Because the kitchen table would stay clean if she made it stay clean. Unlike the fence, unlike the cattle, unlike the future. That was the thing about Clara. She was at war with uncertainty. Every chore was a fortification. Every mended seam was a wall against the possibility that things might, at any moment, come apart entirely. Me was different. Me was 7 years old and built out of questions. Why does the well make that sound? Why do hawks circle instead of going straight? Why does Mr. Brandt write in his book so much? That last one she asked me directly, standing at the base of the ladder while I was on the roof, her head tilted back so far she was nearly looking at the sky. Because I have a bad memory, I told her. Mama says you can't trust a man who writes everything down, because it means he's keeping score. Your mama might be right. Are you keeping score? I thought about it. I'm keeping honest. She considered this with the gravity of a Supreme Court justice evaluating testimony, then nodded once and walked away to talk to one of the Saint chickens. I wrote in my ledger. Me asked about the book. Told her I'm keeping honest. Not sure if that's true or just the version of truth I prefer. The rain came on the 4th night, hard and sudden, the way desert rain arrives, like someone appended a bucket the size of the sky. I was in the barn, which no longer leaked, and I lay there on a bed of fresh straw listening to the water hit the new shingles and feeling a particular variety of satisfaction that I think only people who work with their hands truly understand. I made this thing work. I took something broken and I made it hold. Around midnight, I heard footsteps on the packed earth outside. Then a knock on the barn door, 3 sharp raps, the way Clara did everything, precise and without excess. I opened the door. She stood there in the rain, wearing a coat that was too large for her, James's coat, I suspected, holding a lantern in one hand and a look on her face I hadn't seen before. Not flat, not edged, something open and raw and close to frightened. The creek's rising, she said. Nanton and Lozen's settlement is downstream. I was pulling my boots on before she finished the sentence. We rode out together, Clara on the old bay mare and me on my horse, through rain so heavy it felt personal, like the sky had something specific against us. The creek, which had been a modest, well-mannered stream when I'd seen it 3 days ago, was now something else entirely, a brown churning muscle of water that had jumped its banks and was eating into the land on both sides with a mindless hunger. Nanton's settlement was 4 structures, 2 hogans, a ramada, and a storage building set on a low rise above the creek. In better weather, the rise was more than sufficient. Tonight, the water was halfway up. We found them already moving. Nanton was carrying bundles out of the larger hogan, his movements steady and unhurried despite the water swirling around his knees. Lozen was loading a travois with supplies, her hands fast and certain. 2 other families, I hadn't known there were others, were doing the same, children being passed from arm to arm, animals being led to higher ground. Clara waded in without a word. She took a child from a woman I didn't know, settled the child on her hip with the ease of long practice, and carried them through the water to dry ground. Then she went back, then again. I tied the horses and followed. For 3 hours we worked. The water rose and we worked faster. Nanton directed everything with a calm that I initially mistook for stoicism and later understood was something else. It was faith. Not in anything supernatural or grand. Faith in the people around him. Faith that if he stayed steady, others would stay steady too. He was the center pole of the structure, and as long as he held, the rest would hold. I carried a trunk that weighed more than seemed reasonable for its size. "What's in this?" I grunted. "Seeds," Nanton said. "Medicine. Things that take time to replace." I carried it higher up the ridge and set it down carefully. The way you set down something you understand is more valuable than anything you personally own. By dawn, the water had peaked and begun to recede, leaving behind a landscape rearranged, mud where there had been grass, debris wedged against rocks. One of the hogans tilted on its foundation like a hat knocked sideways. But no one was hurt. Nothing irreplaceable was lost. Clara sat on a rock, James's coat soaked through, her hair undone and plastered to her face. Me was back at the ranch with Lozin, who had taken the children to higher ground early. Clara could have gone with them. She hadn't. I sat next to her, not close, not far. The distance of two people who have done a hard thing together and don't need to narrate it. "You didn't have to come out here," I said. "Yes, I did. I meant, I know what you mean. And I'm telling you, yes, I did." She looked out at the damaged settlement, at Nanton walking among the structures with that same steady calm, already assessing, already planning. And something crossed her face that I can only describe as recognition, as if she were seeing for the first time that her own fortifications, her clean kitchen table and mended seams, were a small version of what Nanton did for his people. Holding steady, keeping the center. "James would have slept through this," she said quietly. It was the first time she'd mentioned him with something other than reverence or resentment. It was the first time she'd mentioned him with simple honesty, and the honesty was this. He was a man she loved who would not have waded into a flooded creek at midnight for people who weren't his family. I didn't respond. Some things don't need a response, they need a witness. I opened my ledger and wrote, "Creek flooded, helped move Nanton's people. Clara carried 3 children through water. James's coat is too big for her." That last detail shouldn't have mattered. I wrote it down anyway. Over the following days, things settled into a pattern, and I want to describe the pattern because patterns are where the truth of a life lives, not in the dramatic moments but in the repetitions. Mornings, I worked on whatever needed fixing, and there was always something, while Clara handled the animals and me did her lessons. Clara taught me herself, using 3 books that she kept wrapped in oilcloth as if they were scripture. Reading, arithmetic, and a volume of American history so biased it made my teeth hurt, though I kept that opinion behind my own teeth. Midday, we ate together. Clara cooked plainly and well. She had a way of making beans taste like something you'd choose to eat rather than something you endured, and her bread was the best I'd had since my mother's, which is a comparison I don't make lightly or often. Afternoons, Lozin came most days. She and Clara would sit on the porch and talk while me played, and I'd work within earshot, not eavesdropping but not plugging my ears either. Lozin was teaching Clara about the plants that grew along the creek, which ones healed, which ones fed, which ones would kill you politely. Clara wrote everything down in a notebook, and I recognized in her note-taking the same impulse that drove my ledger, the belief that if you record something, you might be able to keep it. Evenings, supper, then the quiet that descends on a house when the day's work is done, and there's nothing left to do but exist in each other's company. Me would draw pictures on slate. Clara would mend. I would sharpen tools or oil leather, or do any of the 100 small maintenance tasks that keep a working ranch from sliding into entropy. Sometimes Nanton would come, and he and I would sit on the porch, and he would tell me things. Not stories exactly, more like observations. He'd point at a hawk and tell me what it was hunting based on its circle pattern. He'd pick up a handful of soil and tell me what it meant about the water table. He spoke the way the land spoke, if you knew how to listen in specifics, in evidence, in the accumulated knowledge of people who had been paying attention to this particular piece of earth for longer than anyone with a fence had the right to understand. "You're a careful man," he told me one evening. "I try to be. Most careful men are afraid of something." I didn't answer right away. I turned my ledger over in my hands, feeling the leather, the slight bulge where the spine was wearing through. "I was careless once," I said. "Someone got hurt." He waited, I didn't elaborate, he didn't push. The careful that comes after carelessness, he said, is the truest kind, but it can also become a cage. I wrote that down after he left. The careful that comes after carelessness is the truest kind, but it can also become a cage. Below it I wrote, he means me, he also means Clara. Because I was beginning to see it. The way Clara's discipline, her ferocious control, was not strength but a substitute for it. She controlled what she could because she had been devastated by what she couldn't. James's death hadn't just taken her husband. It had taken her belief that the future was something you could walk toward. Now the future was something that happened to you, and the only defense was to keep your kitchen clean and your fences mended, and your heart at a distance far enough that no one could reach it without your permission. And I was beginning to see that I was doing the same thing. Different method, same disease. My ledger wasn't a record, it was a wall. Every debt cataloged was a relationship held at arm's length. I owe you this. You owe me that. Everything accounted for, everything transactional, nothing risked because nothing was given freely. Nanton saw both of us. That was the unnerving thing about him. He saw us the way he saw the hawk's hunting pattern, through evidence, through attention, through the accumulated wisdom of a man who had been watching people longer than most people had been alive. And he said nothing about it. He just showed up, evening after evening, and sat on the porch and pointed at the sky and waited. 3 weeks after I arrived, me got sick. I need to be precise about this because precision matters, and because the alternative is the kind of vague, sentimental narration that erases the actual terror of watching a child struggle to breathe. It started on a Monday, a cough nothing unusual. By Wednesday, the cough had deepened into something that sounded like it was coming from a place inside her chest that shouldn't have been reachable. By Thursday, she had a fever that I could feel radiating off her body from 2 feet away, and her breathing had acquired a whistle on the exhale that made Clara's face go white. There was no doctor. The nearest one was in Prescott, 2 days' ride, and even if I left immediately, even if the doctor agreed to come, which was not guaranteed, ranch families outside of town were often considered not worth the trip. It would be 4 days before he arrived. 4 days. Clara sat by me's bed and held her daughter's hand and did not cry. I want to be clear about this. She did not cry. She was past crying, or before it, or in some place where crying wasn't available to her because she had used all of her emotional capacity on the task of not flying apart. I rode to Nanton's settlement. Lozen came back with me. She brought a bundle, smaller than the one I'd carried through the flood, but held with the same care. She unwrapped it on the kitchen table, and inside were plants, dried and fresh in small clay containers and wrapped in cloth. Clara watched from the doorway of me's room. "What is that?" she asked, and her voice had lost its flatness. It was raw, stripped, the voice of a woman who had nothing left between herself and her fear. "Medicine," Lozen said simply. "I don't," Clara started, and I could see the war in her. The part of her that wanted to control, to know, to understand every ingredient and every effect, and every possible outcome before allowing it near her daughter. The part of her that kept the kitchen clean. And the part of her that was watching her daughter struggle to breathe and would have agreed to anything, anything at all. Lozen looked at her, steady, calm, not pressuring, just present. "I've treated this before," she said. "In children younger than me, my grandmother taught me and her grandmother taught her. I won't do anything you don't allow." Clara looked at me. I don't know why. I was not me's father. I was not even a friend, not really. I was a man who'd been fixing her barn for 3 weeks. But she looked at me, and in that look was a question that wasn't about medicine or trust or even her daughter. It was about the future. It was about whether the future was something you could walk toward or only something that happened to you. "Let her help," I said. Clara stepped aside. Lozen worked through the night. She brewed something that smelled of sage and something sharper, something green and medicinal that I couldn't identify. She held me's head and helped her drink. She placed warmed cloths on me's chest and changed them every hour. She sang low, quiet in ND, and the singing was not performative or mystical. It was the same thing Clara's clean kitchen was. It was the same thing my ledger was. It was a person imposing order on chaos, saying, "I am here, I am paying attention, I will not let this." Me's fever broke at dawn. Not dramatically, not with a sudden gasp or a cinematic opening of the eyes. Gradually, like a tide going out. Her breathing slowed. The whistle faded. The heat radiating off her small body diminished degree by degree until she was merely warm, and then merely sleeping, and then sleeping so peacefully that Clara finally put her head down on the edge of the bed and wept. I went outside. Some things are private, and a mother's relief is the most private thing I know. Lozen came out a few minutes later. She looked tired, the first time I'd seen tiredness on her, but her eyes were clear. "She'll need to rest for several days," she said. "I'll come back tomorrow with more medicine." "Thank you." She looked at me the way her father looked at me, with that patient, seeing quality. "You said let her help. You didn't say I trust this or this will work. You said let her help. Why?" "Because I didn't know if it would work, but I knew she needed someone to tell her it was all right to let go." "That's not the same as knowing it would work." "No," I said, "it's not." She nodded as if I'd confirmed something she already knew. "The medicine helped, but so did you telling her to let it." I opened my ledger. I looked at it for a long time. Then I closed it and put it back in my pocket without writing anything. Some things you don't record. Some things you just. For a week after Me's fever broke, the ranch existed in a kind of suspended tenderness. Everything was softer. Clara's voice when she called the chickens, still named after saints, still counted every morning and every night, had lost a fraction of its edge. Not much. Enough that I noticed. Me stayed in bed for 3 days, then graduated to the porch, then to the yard, where she immediately began interrogating a beetle about its personal life with the intensity of a federal investigator. I finished the barn. I want to say that clearly because it mattered to me in a way that's hard to articulate without sounding like a man who cares too much about wood and nails. The barn was done. The roof was tight. The walls were solid. The stalls had doors that swung on oiled hinges and latched with a clean metallic click that I tested 4 times, not because I was uncertain, but because the sound satisfied something in me that I'd been carrying around unsatisfied for years. I stood in the finished barn on a Thursday morning and looked at it. A barn, a functional, unbeautiful, entirely adequate barn. I'd built other things in my life, a porch in Abilene, a corral in Silver City, half a church in Tombstone before the funding dried up, but nothing that felt like this. This barn was the first thing I'd built that someone needed, not wanted, needed. I took out my ledger and started to write, and then stopped. The ledger was getting complicated. I've been adding entries that didn't fit the categories I'd established: debts, observations, things to remember. These new entries were something else. Clara heated water for coffee before I asked. Me drew me a picture of my horse, and it looked more like a dog with ambitions, and I kept it. Nanton brought me tobacco and wouldn't let me write it as a debt. What category were these? What accounting system covered things that were given freely, without expectation, without the implicit architecture of obligation? I closed the ledger and put it away. There was still work to do. There's always work to do on a ranch. The way there's always gravity. It's the constant against which everything else is measured. The fence needed proper rebuilding, not just the patchwork Clara had attempted. The chicken coop had a lean to it that suggested ambition toward collapse. The well mechanism was functional but inefficient, requiring about twice the effort it should have for each bucket of water. But something had shifted in the texture of the work. I was no longer fixing things for meals and a place to sleep. I was fixing things because they were broken and I was here, and that was enough. This is a dangerous realization for a man who has spent 6 years keeping careful accounts. Clara began talking to me. Not the transactional exchanges we'd had before: suppers at 6, the feed bin needs filling, don't come inside without knocking, but actual talking. It happened gradually, the way most real things happen, without announcement or ceremony. It started with the chickens. I was replacing a board on the coop when she came out for the morning feeding. She called each chicken by name as it emerged: St. Francis, St. Teresa, St. Agnes, St. Jude, St. Cecilia, St. Clare, St. Benedict, St. Catherine, St. Anne, St. Joan, St. Rita, and I said, without planning to, "Why saints?" She looked at me as if I'd asked why the sky was up. "Because they endured," she said. I looked at the chickens. St. Jude was attempting to eat a rock. St. Francis was standing on St. Benedict's back for no apparent reason. They don't seem particularly saintly. Saints weren't particularly saintly either. That's the point. They were regular people who kept going. She scattered feed. The chickens rushed her with the urgency of creatures who believed, against all evidence, that this particular feeding might be their last. James named the first three, she said, and then quieter. I named the rest after he died. I needed them to be something, not just chickens. I understand that. Do you? I keep a ledger where I write down debts I'll never collect and observations nobody will read. We all have our ways of making things mean something. She almost smiled. Not quite. A structural preparation for smiling, like the foundation of a house that hasn't been built yet. This became our pattern, small conversations around the edges of work. Never head-on, never sustained. She'd tell me something about the ranch, and wrapped inside the practical information would be a fragment of something personal, and I'd receive it without pressing for more, because Clara was like the desert. You couldn't rush what grew there. You could only be present and not trample it. She told me about James in pieces. He'd been a dreamer, she said, a big-idea man. He'd bought this land on the promise of a railroad that never came, with money borrowed from a brother who never forgave the debt. He'd been kind. He'd been impractical. He'd been the kind of man who made you feel like anything was possible, which is wonderful until the possibilities run out and you're left on a ranch with no railroad, no money, and a fence that needs fixing in 11 places. He died of fever, she said one afternoon while I was digging a new post hole and she was holding the post. 3 years ago, it was fast. 1 week he was talking about expanding the herd, and the next week he was. She stopped, adjusted her grip on the post. It was fast, she repeated, as if speed were a mercy. Maybe it was. I'm sorry, I said, and meant it, though the words felt inadequate, the way words always feel inadequate against the fact of someone's absence. Everyone's sorry. Hector Medina is sorry. The women at church are sorry. Nanton is sorry in that way of his where he doesn't say the word but you feel it. I'm drowning in sorry. She said it without bitterness, just exhaustion. The exhaustion of a woman who'd been offered sympathy like a bucket with no bottom. It kept being poured, and she kept receiving it, and it never filled anything. What would help, I asked, instead of sorry? She looked at me, straight on, for the first time since I'd arrived. Her eyes were gray-green, the color of sage after rain, and they held an expression I couldn't read. Or rather, one I could read but didn't trust myself to read correctly because the consequences of being wrong felt too large. This, she said, someone holding the post while I tell them about it. I held the post. She told me about it, not everything, enough. Nanton arrived that evening with a gift I didn't ask for and couldn't refuse. He brought a saddle. Not a new one, a saddle so worn and worked that the leather had achieved a color and softness that no tanner could produce intentionally. It was the kind of saddle that had been shaped by decades of use into something that was less an object and more a record. My son's, he said, setting it on the porch rail. He doesn't ride anymore. I looked at the saddle. I looked at Nanton. I can't accept this. You're not accepting it. I'm placing it here because it should be used, and it isn't being used where it is. That's accepting with extra words. He almost smiled. I learned from politicians. We sat on the porch. The evening was warm, the kind of warm that makes you realize how much time you spend braced against cold or heat, and how rare it is to simply exist at the right temperature. Clara told me about her husband, I said. James was a good man who made poor decisions. She said he was a dreamer. Dreamers make poor decisions beautifully. That's what makes them dangerous. He paused. Clara loved him the way you love a fire you know will burn down your house. You stay warm and you know the cost, and you stay anyway because the alternative is cold. And now she's cold. Now she's cold, and she's become very good at being cold, good enough that she's mistaken it for strength. I turned my ledger over in my hands. I'd been doing that more often, holding it without opening it, using it as a fidget object rather than a record-keeping tool. This bothered me in a way I couldn't specify. Your daughter saved me's life, I said. My daughter used knowledge that was given to her by women who came before her. She didn't save anyone. She connected me to something larger than any one person's skill. That's a generous way to describe it. It's an accurate way. Generosity and accuracy aren't enemies, Eli. Only careful men believe they are. There it was again, the cage. He didn't elaborate, he didn't need to. Nanton had a gift, or a discipline, or maybe they were the same thing, for placing a single sentence where it would do the most work, and then leaving it there, unsupported, undefended, to either take root or blow away. This one took root. I started laughing more. This seems like a strange thing to note, but for a man who'd spent 6 years cataloging debts, it was seismic. The laughing started because of me, who was, I'd discovered, one of the funniest people I'd ever met, though she didn't know she was funny, which made her funnier. She'd narrate her activities to the chickens. "St. Jude, I'm going to check on the fence now, and I need you to guard the porch, and if any bandits come, you peck them." St. Jude would look at her with the blank, primordial stare of a creature whose brain was the size of a walnut, and me would say, "Good talk, Jude," and march off with the confidence of a general who just secured a tactical alliance. The first time I laughed, really laughed, the kind that ambushes you and takes over your whole chest, Clara looked at me from across the yard as if I'd spontaneously grown a second head. Then something happened to her face. A softening, a thawing, the foundation of a smile, that same almost structure I'd seen before, except this time a wall went up on it. Just one, small, but there. Me noticed the change before either of us did. Children are seismographs for emotional shifts. They register vibrations that adults have trained themselves to ignore. "Mama laughed yesterday," she told me, as if reporting a scientific anomaly. We were sitting on the porch, me mending a bridle, her drawing another portrait of my horse, this one slightly more equine than the last, though the legs were still aspirational. "Did she?" She laughed at St. Francis falling off the fence, but she laughed, she doesn't laugh. "She used to." When Daddy was alive, she laughed a lot, then she stopped, like someone turned off a lamp. I didn't write this down. I committed it to memory instead, which was new for me. My ledger was losing its authority. The next day, I did something deliberate. Something calculated, which felt wrong because calculation was what I was trying to unlearn. But sometimes you have to use the old tools to build the new thing. I dropped a bucket of water on my own foot while Clara was watching. Not hard enough to hurt, just enough to soak my boot and make a spectacular splash and produce a reaction from me, hopping on one foot, swearing under my breath, that I knew, from years of being a person in the world, was inherently funny. Clara stared at me, her mouth did something complicated, and then she laughed. It was a short laugh, surprised out of her more than offered. It sounded rusty, like a hinge that hadn't moved in years. But it was real, and it changed the shape of her face in a way that made me realize the flatness I'd been seeing wasn't her face at all. It was a mask she wore over her face, and underneath it she was someone entirely different, someone who laughed at stupid men dropping water on their own feet. "You did that on purpose," she said. "I absolutely did not." "You're lying." "I'm frequently lying, but not about this." She looked at me with those sage-colored eyes, and the mask was off just for a moment, and underneath it was exhaustion and fear and something else. Something that might have been the early, tentative beginning of hope, if hope were a seedling in rocky soil, improbable, fragile, stubbornly alive. "You're ridiculous," she said. "I'm aware." She went inside. I stood in the yard with one wet boot and wrote nothing in my ledger and felt something I hadn't felt in 6 years. The terrifying, intoxicating, entirely irrational sense that I might be exactly where I was supposed to be. The trouble came on a Saturday. It always comes. I've learned this the way I've learned that roofs leak and fences sag and people leave, through repetition and a refusal to be surprised. 2 men rode up to the ranch in the early afternoon. I was out at the far fence line, restringing wire, and I heard them before I saw them. Hoofbeats carrying that particular urgency that distinguishes a man with a purpose from a man out for a ride. By the time I got back to the house, they were on the porch, talking to Clara. She stood in the doorway the way she'd stood the first day I arrived, one hand on me's shoulder, body blocking the entrance. But her posture was different from that first day. It was tighter, coiled. The men were brothers named Garrett and Sullivan Phelps. I knew them by reputation, which was sufficient. They owned a spread about 15 miles west, big enough to require a dozen hands, and they had the particular kind of confidence that comes from being the largest property holders in a region where property was the only measure of a man's standing. Garrett was the older one, thick, red-faced, with a voice calibrated to make you feel like you were on the wrong side of a transaction. Sullivan was leaner, quieter, the kind of quiet that watches. "Mrs. Holloway," Garrett was saying as I approached, "I'm making a fair offer. $300 for the northern 40 acres. That's above market for land with no water rights and a fence held together by prayer." "The northern 40 has water access from the creek," Clara said. and the fence is being repaired. Garrett looked at me, assessed me the way you assess a tool. Is it useful? Is it broken? Should I care about it? By whom? He asked. By me, I said. I stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. I didn't go up. Something about the geometry of the situation, Clara above me, below, these men in between, made me want to hold my position and let them come to me. And you are? Eli Brandt. I'm working the ranch. Working? He tasted the word like something sour. Mrs. Holloway, you have a hired man doing repairs on land you can barely hold as it is. I'm offering you a solution. You're offering me a reduction, Clara said, and her voice was flat in the old way, the Blade way. You want my northern acres because they connect to your grazing land, and without them, your cattle have to go 3 miles around to reach water. That's not generosity, Mr. Phelps. That's geography. Garrett's face shifted. The false friendliness dropped away, and underneath it was something harder, something that looked like frustration crossbred with entitlement. Your husband understood the value of cooperation, he said. My husband sold you his southern easement for half its worth, because you told him the railroad was coming, and we both know how that turned out. Silence, the particular kind of silence that falls when someone has said something so precisely accurate that the room, or in this case, the porch, has to recalibrate. Sullivan spoke for the first time. Think about it, Mrs. Holloway. That's all we're asking. His voice was reasonable, measured, and it set my teeth on edge because reasonable men asking you to think about it are almost always asking you to think your way into agreeing with them. They left. Clara stood on the porch until they were out of sight, then went inside without speaking. Me looked at me from the doorway. Mama's scared, she whispered. I know. She's scared they'll take the ranch. They can't take it. Daddy said they couldn't take the easement, and they did. I didn't have an answer for that. Me waited for one, and when it didn't come, she gave me a look that was far too old for her face and went inside. I opened my ledger. I wrote, Phelps brothers came, want the northern 40. Clara's afraid but won't show it. Me sees everything. Then I wrote something else, something I'd been composing in my head for weeks and hadn't yet committed to paper because writing it down would make it real. I am in love with Clara Holloway. This is a debt I don't know how to categorize. I looked at the words. They sat on the page with the same stubborn, improbable, undeniable presence as a seedling in rocky soil. I closed the ledger. That night I couldn't sleep. The barn was comfortable. I'd made it comfortable, which was part of the problem. I'd made it home, and you're not supposed to make a barn home. It disrupts the transactional nature of the arrangement. And I lay on my straw bed staring at the roof I'd repaired and thinking about the Phelps brothers and Clara and the future. The future, that was Clara's enemy, the thing she feared above all else. The empty future, stretching out like land with no railroad, promised, expected, never arriving. And now here were the Phelps brothers offering to buy pieces of it, to make the future smaller and more manageable by making the ranch smaller and more manageable, and the terrible thing was that the offer made sense. Clara couldn't maintain this land alone. The fence was evidence of that. The barn had been evidence of that. Everything I'd fixed was evidence that things had been breaking faster than she could keep up. But the northern 40 was the creek land. Without it, the ranch lost its water. Without water, the ranch was just acreage. And acreage without water in the Arizona territory was, I've heard it described many ways, but the most honest is, a place where things go to wait for permission to die. Around 2 in the morning, I heard footsteps again. Different from before, lighter, more hesitant. Not Clara's decisive 3 knocks, but a quiet, almost apologetic tapping. I opened the door. Lozen stood there, wrapped in a blanket against the night chill. My father wants to speak with you, she said. Tonight. I pulled on my boots without asking why. When Nanton summoned you at 2 in the morning, the question wasn't why, but how fast could you get there? We walked. The night was clear. The stars performing that thing they do in the desert where they stop being distant and start being present, as if they've come down from wherever they usually are to examine the earth more closely. The Phelps brothers came to see Clara, I said. I know. How? This land talks. If you listen, you hear everything. We reached Nanton's settlement. The Hogans had been repaired. I'd helped with some of it after the flood, and Nanton sat outside the larger one, a small fire burning in front of him. He gestured to a spot across the fire, and I sat. You care about Clara, he said, no preamble. I do. And me. Yes. The Phelps family has wanted this land for 12 years. They offered James the same deal more than once. James refused because he believed the railroad would make the land too valuable to sell. He was right about the value and wrong about the railroad. Clara can't sell the Northern 40. She loses the creek. She knows this. So what does she do? Nanton fed a stick to the fire. Sparks rose and joined the conspiracy of stars. There is a spring, he said. On the eastern edge of her property, below ground, my grandmother knew about it. The people who lived here before fences knew about it. It was used for generations. Then it was forgotten because the creek was easier. A spring that doesn't depend on rainfall the way the creek does. It flows from deep in the rock. It has never dried. If Clara had an independent water source, the Northern 40 becomes less critical. The Northern 40 becomes negotiating strength rather than survival necessity. I stared at the fire. Why are you telling me this? Nanton looked at me with those patient eyes. Because you asked what would help, not what would fix, not what would solve, what would help, and I've been waiting to see if you meant it. How long have you been waiting? Since the night you carried my seed trunk through the flood. I sat with that, the fire crackled. Lozen brought tea, something herbal, warm, slightly bitter, and sat beside her father. The spring is near the old juniper grove, Nanton said. 3 feet below the surface, maybe 4, you'll need to dig. I'll need to dig. Yes. Does Clara know about it? No, James never dug because James was waiting for the railroad. Digging a well was not part of his dream. It was too small. I finished the tea. I stood up. I looked at Nanton and Lozen, these 2 people who had been steady and present for 3 years, who had brought medicine and seeds and knowledge, who had waded into a flooded creek to help a woman who wasn't their family, except that she was in the only way that mattered, which is the way where you show up. Thank you, I said. Don't thank me, Nanton said. Dig. I started digging the next morning. I didn't tell Clara what I was doing. Not because I wanted to keep a secret, but because I didn't want to give her hope that might turn out to be empty. She'd had enough empty hopes. She'd had a husband full of them. The juniper grove was at the eastern edge of the property, a stand of old trees that had been growing there since before anyone with a surname had opinions about the land. They were twisted, thick-trunked, aromatic in the way that junipers are sharp, clean, a scent that makes you feel like your sinuses have been introduced to truth. I picked a spot near the largest tree, where the ground showed a slight depression that might have been nothing or might have been the faintest surface expression of water below. I started digging. Have you ever dug a well by hand? I don't recommend it as a recreational activity. It's monotonous, backbreaking, and productive of the particular kind of doubt that comes from doing hard work with no guarantee of result. Each shovelful might be the one before water. Each shovelful might be followed by 10,000 more shovelfuls of dry, indifferent earth. I dug for 2 days and found nothing. My hands blistered, tore, hardened. My back acquired an ache that nested between my shoulder blades and refused to leave. My ledger sat unopened in my pocket. Me found me on the 2nd afternoon. What are you doing? She stood at the edge of my hole, which was about 4 feet deep and 6 feet across, a respectable piece of absence, and looked down at me with the expression of someone witnessing either genius or insanity and unable to determine which. Digging. Why? Because something might be down here. What? Water? She considered this. Mama gets water from the well. This would be a different water. Is different water better? Sometimes different is better. Sometimes it's just different, but you don't know until you dig. She sat down at the edge of the hole, legs dangling, and watched me dig. She didn't ask more questions. She just watched, with the patience of a child who has learned that adults sometimes do things that only make sense later, and the best strategy is to be present for the later. On the 3rd day, Clara found us both. She came walking across the property with that stride of hers, purposeful, no wasted motion, and stopped at the edge of the hole, which was now 5 feet deep and required a ladder. Eli. I looked up at her. From down in the hole, she was framed against the sky, her dark hair loose for once, the sun behind her turning her into a silhouette. Clara, what in the name of St. Rita are you doing? Digging a well. We have a well. We might need another one. Why? And here was the moment, the edge of the decision. I could tell her about the spring, about Nanton, about the Phelps brothers and the water rights and the strategic value of an independent water source. I could present it logically, transactionally, the way my ledger would present it, asset, liability, net position. Or I could tell her the truth. Because I want you to have options, I said. Not just survival, options, the ability to choose what comes next instead of just enduring it. She stared at me. The wind moved her hair across her face. Me sat at the edge of the hole, swinging her legs, watching us both. You can't just dig a well on someone's land without telling them, Clara said. I know, I'm sorry. You're not sorry. I'm sorry I didn't tell you. I'm not sorry I'm digging. A long pause. The kind of pause that's not empty but full. Full of calculations, recalculations, the rapid reassessment of who someone is and what their presence in your life means. If you hit rock and there's nothing there, she said, you're filling this hole back in. Fair. And you're making supper tonight. I'm tired. She turned and walked back toward the house. Me looked at me. She was grinning, the first full grin I'd seen on that child, and she whispered, loud enough for the chickens to hear. She didn't say stop. No, she didn't. I dug. On the fourth day of digging, at a depth of just over 6 feet, the soil changed. It went from dry, packed earth to something darker, cooler, with a density that resisted the shovel differently. I stopped. I pressed my palm flat against the bottom of the hole. It was damp. Not wet, not flowing, but damp in the way that means water is near, the way the air changes before rain, the way wood darkens before it rots, the way the earth announces its secrets to anyone patient enough to listen. I dug another foot. The dampness increased. Small pools formed in the shovel marks. The soil became mud, then slurry, then. Water, clear, cold, rising slowly from the fractured rock beneath. Not a gush, not a spring in the dramatic sense. A seep, a steady upwelling, the earth giving up something it had been holding for a very long time. I climbed out of the hole. I was covered in mud. My hands were raw, my back was a country of pain. And I was standing there looking at the thin shine of water at the bottom of a hole in the ground, and I was weeping. Not for the water, for what it meant. Clara didn't have to sell. Clara had a water source that was hers, that nobody could divert or negotiate away. That came from the deep rock and would come whether the creek flooded or dried, whether the Phelps brothers made offers or threats, whether the railroad came or didn't. Clara had options. I pulled out my ledger. I opened it to the last entry. I am in love with Clara Holloway. This is a debt I don't know how to categorize, and beneath it I wrote. Found the spring, 6 feet down, eastern Juniper Grove. The water is cold and clear, and it doesn't owe anybody. I need to tell you about the week that followed, because it's the week where everything I thought I understood about Clara Holloway, about myself, about the careful architecture of debts and distances I'd built my life around, came apart. And what replaced it was messier, less certain, and more true than anything I'd recorded in 6 years of keeping my ledger. Clara came to see the spring on the 5th day. She brought me, who brought St. Jude, tucked under one arm like a furious, feathered football. The three of them stood at the edge of the hole and looked down at the water, which had risen to about 8 inches and was holding steady, cold and clear, catching the morning light. Clara didn't speak for a long time. I stood off to the side, giving her space. I'd learned that about her. She needed physical distance in emotional moments, the way some people need air. Crowd her and she'd retreat behind the flatness, the blade voice, the clean kitchen discipline. Give her room and she'd sometimes let you see what was underneath. How did you know? She asked finally. Nanton told me. His grandmother knew about it. She nodded slowly. Nanton's grandmother. A pause. Not the railroad, not a federal survey, not a land assessor, a grandmother. Yes. James paid a surveyor $40 once. The man came out with instruments and charts and told James the only reliable water on the property was the creek. She shook her head, and the motion carried something, not bitterness, not anymore. More like the exhausted recognition that irony doesn't respect your grief, and sometimes the universe is making a point at your expense. The surveyor wasn't wrong about the creek, I said. He just didn't know what was under the junipers. Because he didn't ask the right people. Because he didn't ask anyone, he brought instruments. Clara looked at me. That direct, full-on look she'd started doing, the one that made me feel like I was being appraised not for what I was worth, but for who I actually was, which is a far more terrifying evaluation. You ask people, she said. I do. You asked Nanton. He offered, I listened, there's a difference. Is there? I thought about it, maybe not. Me lowered St. Jude into the hole. The chicken stood at the edge of the water, looked at it, looked up at me with an expression of profound indignation and began drinking. He likes it, me announced. He's a chicken, Clara said. He likes everything liquid. He's discerning, me said, with the dignity of a child who has assigned a chicken a personality and refuses to retract it. Clara's mouth twitched, just the corner, just a fraction, but I saw it and it was the most beautiful mechanical operation I'd ever witnessed, a woman's face remembering how to express joy. She looked back at the water. What do we do now? It was the we that did it. She hadn't said, what do I do now? Which was her old formulation, the one that carried the weight of solitary responsibility like a pack animal. She said we, and the word included me, and she knew it included me, and she said it anyway. We dig it wider, I said. We line it with stone, we build a proper well housing, and we tell the Phelps brothers that you have an independent water source, and their offer for the Northern 40 is about 60% below what the land is actually worth. She considered this. The wind did its thing with her hair. Me was explaining water composition to St. Jude. You know how to line a well with stone. I know how to learn. That's not the same thing. No, but it's what I've got. She looked at me for 3 more seconds. 4, 5, I counted because I had nothing else to do with the terror. Supper's at 6, she said. And then so quietly I almost missed it. Come inside without knocking. She picked up me and St. Jude simultaneously, one on each hip, the chicken squawking, and walked back toward the house. I stood at the edge of the hole and watched her go, and I was aware that something enormous had just happened, something that didn't have a category in my ledger, something that existed entirely outside the system of debts and distances I'd been living inside. She'd invited me in. Not to the house. Well, yes, to the house. But also to the structure she'd been building for 3 years, the fortification of solitude and control and saintly chickens and clean kitchen tables. She'd opened a door in it, not wide, a crack. Enough to suggest that the door existed and could, with patience and the right amount of not pushing, be opened further. I climbed down into the hole. I knelt in the mud beside the water. I cupped my hands and drank. It was cold and clear and tasted like the earth mineral, ancient, indifferent to my feelings. Water doesn't care about love stories. Water just does what water does. But I cared. And I knelt there in the mud and I cared, and the caring was like the water, rising from somewhere deep, filling the space that had been dug, impossible to undo. Lining a well with stone is harder than you think and easier than you'd expect, which is true of most things worth doing. Nanton came to help. He brought his nephew, a quiet young man named Goyakla, who was approximately 19 years old and could lift stones that I struggled to roll. Goyakla didn't speak much, not out of unfriendliness, but out of a temperament that found words unnecessary when actions were available. He communicated primarily through the angle of his eyebrows, which were surprisingly expressive. One eyebrow raised, that stone won't fit. Both eyebrows raised, that was heavier than I expected. Eyebrows lowered in the center, hand me the chisel, I'll shape it. I wrote in my ledger, Goyakla's eyebrows are a more efficient communication system than English. Lozen came and went, bringing food and tea, and once a root she said would help with the persistent ache between my shoulder blades. She was right. The root tasted terrible and worked magnificently, and I told her so, and she said, most things that work taste terrible. Sweetness is for things that want to be liked, not things that want to be useful. I wrote that down too, then crossed it out, then wrote it again. My ledger was becoming less of an account book and more of a I don't know what, a conversation with myself, an argument between the man I'd been and the man I was becoming. Clara watched the well take shape. She came out every day, sometimes with me, sometimes alone, and she stood at the edge and watched the way you watch a house being built, with investment, with anxiety, with the suppressed excitement of someone who's allowing themselves to believe that a future is being constructed. One afternoon, she climbed down the ladder into the well. It was about 8 feet deep now, the walls lined with fitted stone up to about the 4-foot mark, the water channeled into a cleared basin at the bottom. She stood ankle-deep in the water and looked up at the circle of sky above her. "It's like standing inside the earth," she said. "That's exactly what you're doing." "I know, but I didn't expect it to feel like this." "Like what?" She pressed her palms flat against the stone wall. "Like being held." I was at the top of the well, looking down. Our positions were reversed from usual, she below, me above, and the reversal changed something about the way we saw each other. From above, she looked smaller, more vulnerable, standing in water that she owned, surrounded by stone that she would depend on. "Clara." "Yes." I wanted to say something. I had a sentence prepared, a real one, not a ledger entry, but an actual statement of actual feeling, and it was rising in me the way the water had risen through the rock, slowly, inevitably, from somewhere deep. "The mortar needs to cure for 3 days before we add the next course," I said instead. She looked up at me, and she knew. I could tell she knew. She knew what I'd been about to say, and she knew I'd pulled back from it, and she knew why, and her expression, I can only describe it as gentle frustration. The frustration of a woman who had decided to open a door, and was now watching a man stand on the other side of it, carefully measuring the threshold. 3 days, she said. All right. She climbed the ladder. As she passed me, she put her hand on my arm, not gripping, resting. The weight of her hand was negligible, and it was the heaviest thing I'd ever felt. "You're very annoying," she said quietly. "I've been told." "By whom?" "Everyone, my sister, my horse, 3 sheriffs, a Comanche woman, Nanton by implication." "Good, then it's not just me." She went inside. I sat on the edge of the well and opened my ledger and wrote. She touched my arm. Her hand weighed nothing. It weighed everything. These are incompatible observations, and I don't care. The Phelps brothers came back on a Wednesday. I want to say I was prepared for it, that I'd planned a speech or a strategy or at least positioned myself in a place that communicated authority. I was under the porch, fixing the left side sag, lying on my back in the dirt, holding a support beam in place with one hand and a hammer in the other, when the hoofbeats arrived. I rolled out from under the porch and stood up with as much dignity as a man covered in dirt and cobwebs can muster, which is not much. Garrett and Sullivan Phelps sat their horses in the yard. Garrett looked at me with the particular disdain of a man who considers manual labor a sign of deficiency. "Mr. Brandt still here?" "Still here." Clara emerged from the house. No hand on me's shoulder this time. Me was with Lozen at Nanton's settlement, learning to identify plants, a curriculum Clara had approved, and which I suspected was being used to ensure me was out of earshot for exactly this kind of visit. "Mrs. Holloway," Garrett said, "we've come to renew our offer, $350. "You've raised it," Clara said, "as a gesture of good faith." "Good faith," she said it the way she named the chickens, with conviction and irony braided together so tightly you couldn't separate them. "Mrs. Holloway, I'll be direct. Winter's coming. You're running this ranch with one hired man and no reliable income. The Northern 40 is a luxury you can't afford." Clara stood on the porch. She was quiet for a moment, and in that moment I saw everything she'd been building, the discipline, the control, the saintly chickens, the clean kitchen, the 3 years of holding steady against a future she feared, and I saw something new. Resolution. Not the brittle kind she'd been running on. Something deeper, rooted, drawing from a source she hadn't had before. "Mr. Phelps," she said, "I have an independent water source on the eastern portion of my property. A spring-fed well, currently being developed, that provides water regardless of seasonal creek variations. The Northern 40's value to me is no longer contingent on creek access." Garrett's face went through several phases of rearrangement. Surprise, calculation, doubt, recalculation. Sullivan beside him went very still. "A spring," Garrett said. "A spring. Convenient timing." "Convenient for me, yes." "We'd want to verify." "You're welcome to ride out and look at it. The water's about 8 inches deep and rising, cold, clear, and on my land." A silence, the kind where power shifts invisibly like tectonic plates adjusting. Clara stood on her sagging porch, less sagging now, I'd fixed most of it, and the Phelps brothers sat on their expensive horses, and the mathematics of the situation rewrote itself in real time. 350 is below market for irrigable land, Clara said. If you'd like to make an offer that reflects the actual value, which, with an independent water source, is considerably higher, I'll listen. But I'm not selling necessity. If I sell, it'll be choice, and the price will reflect that. Garrett looked at Sullivan. Sullivan looked at Clara. Something passed between them, the recognition, perhaps, that the woman they'd been negotiating with as a desperate widow was not, in fact, desperate, and might never have been, and might have been something else entirely, something they'd misread because they'd been measuring her with instruments instead of asking. They left, no counteroffer, no threats, just the quiet departure of men who needed to recalculate. Clara stood on the porch until they were gone, then sat down heavily on the top step, as if the performance of strength had taken its physical toll, which of course it had, because performing strength is exhausting, which is why it's always better to actually have it. I sat beside her, close, not the careful distance I'd been maintaining, close the way you sit beside someone you've stopped being afraid of being near. "Where did that come from?" I asked. "I don't know." She leaned forward, elbows on knees. "I've been rehearsing what I'd say to them for 3 years. Every version was some form of please leave me alone. That's the first time I said something different." "You said something that was true." "That's different." "For you, yes." She looked at me sideways. "That's a rude thing to say to someone who just won a negotiation." "I'm an annoying person. You've established this." She laughed, not the rusty, surprised laugh from the drop bucket incident. A real laugh with warmth in it, with something that sounded like relief and something that sounded like the beginning of a future she wasn't afraid of. I reached over and took her hand. I did it without planning, without calculation, without recording it first in my ledger as a debt to be categorized. I just did it because her hand was there, and mine was there, and the distance between them had become intolerably stupid. She didn't pull away, she didn't look at me. She looked straight ahead, at the yard, at the chickens. St. Joan was bullying St. Benedict again. At the fence I'd rebuilt, at the land stretching out in every direction. And she held my hand with a grip that was firm and sure and not going anywhere. We sat like that for a while, not talking, not needing to. That evening I told Clara the thing I hadn't told her. The thing that lived in my ledger between the lines, in the white space around the debts and observations. We were on the porch. Me was asleep. The stars were performing their desert trick, crowding close, obliterating the distance between above and below. 6 years ago, I said, I was working a ranch in New Mexico, the Harlan spread outside Las Cruces. The owner had a son, 14 years old, named David. David wanted to learn roping, and I was teaching him, and one day I let him practice on a colt that wasn't broke yet because he was ready. I thought he was ready, and the colt threw him. I stopped. The words were harder to say than I'd expected, even after 6 years, even after writing around them in my ledger 100 times without writing them directly. He broke his back, I said. David, he lived, but he never walked right again, and it was my fault. Not because I'd been malicious or negligent in the way people usually mean, because I'd been careless. I'd been casual about something that required precision, and a boy paid for it. Clara was quiet. She didn't fill the silence with reassurance, which I was grateful for, because reassurance would have been a lie and we both would have known it. "That's why you keep the ledger," she said. "That's why I keep the ledger. You're counting debts you can never repay, because one debt is too large to face directly." "Yes." She was quiet again. The stars did their thing. A coyote called from somewhere north and another answered from somewhere east, and the two voices wove together in the darkness, finding each other across distance. "I am afraid of the future," Clara said. "That's what it is underneath everything. I am afraid that I will wake up one day and me will be grown, and the ranch will be gone, and I'll have spent my whole life holding on so tight that I forgot to live in it. To live in it, yes." She turned to face me. In the starlight, her features were soft, undefined, and I thought that this was how she was supposed to look, not flat, not edged, not disciplined into sharpness, but soft. The way a person looks when they stop defending themselves against the world. "I don't know how to do this," she said. "Neither do I." You seem like you know. I'm a man who dropped a bucket of water on his own foot to make a woman laugh. I know nothing. That worked, though. It was a low-quality strategy. But it worked. And then she kissed me, or I kissed her, or we kissed each other. The verb assignment matters less than the fact, which was this. Two people who had been keeping careful distance, measuring debts, recording observations, building walls against the future, stopped. Stopped all of it. Let the ledger close, let the kitchen stay dirty, let the fence sag, let the chickens do whatever Saint Chickens do unsupervised. It lasted, I don't know how long. The kind of interval that doesn't fit on a timeline because it exists outside of time, in the same place that water exists before it surfaces, in the same place that grief lives before it becomes something else. When it ended, not ended, paused. She pulled back and looked at me, and her eyes were bright, and she was not afraid. "Stay," she said. "I'm staying. I don't mean in the barns. I know. I mean't. I know what you mean, Clara." She exhaled, a long, slow breath, the kind you take when you've been holding something for a very long time and finally set it down. I want to tell you that everything was simple after that. That the well was completed, and the Phelps brothers retreated, and me grew up happy, and the chickens achieved actual sainthood. Some of that happened, not all of it, not simply. We finished the well. Nanton blessed it, or rather, he performed a ceremony that I didn't fully understand and didn't need to fully understand, because understanding wasn't the point. Participation was. Lozin brought seeds that grew near the well, plants that liked the water, that would anchor the soil, that would turn the juniper grove into something green and alive, in a way the rest of the ranch aspired to but hadn't achieved. Me adjusted to my presence in the house with the adaptability that children have and adults envy. She didn't call me anything for 2 weeks. Not Mr. Brandt, not Eli, not any title at all. She'd just appear beside me and start talking, her sentences erupting fully formed like geysers, directed at me without preamble or address. Then one morning she called me Eli, not loudly. Not with ceremony. She said, "Eli, St. Teresa got out again," the way you'd tell anyone whose name you knew, and it was the most natural thing in the world, and it broke something in me that needed breaking, the last wall, the final distance, the ledger entry approach to human connection that I'd been using as a shield. I took out my ledger that night. Clara was reading to me. I could hear her voice through the wall, the rise and fall of a story, something about a princess and a tower, though Clara's version seemed to involve significantly more agricultural detail than the original, and I opened the ledger to the first page. I read through it, 6 years of debts, observations, things to remember. The record of a man in careful retreat from his own life, measuring every interaction, cataloging every obligation, keeping score because keeping score was safer than keeping faith. I took a pencil and wrote on the last blank page, "This ledger is closed." Not because the debts are paid, but because some things are not debts. Me calling me Eli. Clara's hand in mine, Nanton's patience, Lozin's medicine, Goyakla's eyebrows, the spring, the chickens, the way Clara looks at the future now, not like an enemy, but like a room she hasn't entered yet. These are not debts. These are gifts. I don't know the accounting for gifts. I don't want to learn. I closed the ledger. I put it in the trunk at the foot of the bed in the house, the bed beside Clara's, because she'd insisted on propriety, and I respected that. And anyway, 2 beds in 1 room is its own kind of closeness. I didn't open the ledger again. Not once. Not when the Phelps brothers came back with a real offer, $1,200, which Clara negotiated to $1,500 for the outer 20 acres only, keeping the creek access and the spring. And not when the money came through and Clara stood in the kitchen, holding the bank draft, with an expression I can only describe as bewildered hope. Not when me got sick again, briefly, a minor thing, Lozin treated it in 2 days, and Clara grabbed my hand so hard I thought she'd break it and said, "Not again, not again, not again," into the dark of 3 a.m., and I held her until the fever broke and the not again became a not this time. Not when Nanton died. It happened in February, quietly the way Nanton did everything. Lozin came to the ranch in the early morning, and I knew before she spoke because her face, which was normally composed and warm, was composed and empty, and the emptiness was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. "Last night," she said, in his sleep. Clara made tea. I did nothing useful. Me sat on Lozin's lap and held her hand, and Lozin let her, and the 2 of them were very still together. We went to the settlement. The other families were already there, and the grief was communal in a way I hadn't experienced before. Not individual, not walled off, but shared, distributed, carried collectively like a weight that's too heavy for one person but manageable when everyone takes a piece. I stood at the edge of it. I was an outsider to this grief, and I knew it, and I respected the boundary. But Goyakla found me and led me to where Nanton lay, and I stood there looking at this man who had shown me a spring, who had waited patiently while I figured out what kind of person I was, who had told me that careful men build cages and then sat on my porch every evening until I understood that the cage was optional. I wanted to write it in my ledger. The instinct was so strong it was physical, a reaching toward my vest pocket, a grasping for the old tool, the old distance. Record it, catalog it, transform it from a feeling into an entry. The ledger was in the trunk was in the house was a mile away. I stood there with nothing between me and the grief, and I let it do what grief does, which is everything. The months that followed were, I keep wanting to say, hard, but that's not right. Hard implies resistance. What they were was full. Full of work, full of adjustment, full of the ongoing project of building a life with someone while the life is already being lived. Lozin took over Nanton's role, or rather, she stepped into the space he'd occupied and filled it her own way. She was sterner than her father, more direct, less inclined to let silence do the teaching. Where Nanton would sit and wait for you to arrive at understanding, Lozin would tell you where understanding was and suggest you get there faster. Clara and Lozin's friendship deepened into something I don't have a word for, not sisterhood, not partnership, not alliance. Something that included all of those and exceeded them. They moved around each other with the ease of people who have stopped performing their relationship and started simply having it. Me grew. She grew the way children grow, imperceptibly until suddenly, startlingly, she was taller and louder and her questions had gotten harder and her drawings of my horse had gotten better and St. Jude had died of old age peacefully in the coop and been replaced by St. Jude II, who had exactly the same personality as his predecessor, which is to say, belligerent, indiscriminate, and impervious to reason. I built things, a proper well-housing over the spring, a new chicken coop larger, with a design suggested by Goyakla using a system of interlocking joints I'd never seen before and which was vastly superior to anything I'd learned from white carpenters. A room onto the house, me's room, because she was getting too old to share with us, and because everyone deserves a door they can close. Clara and I were married in April. Not in a church, the nearest one was in Prescott, and anyway, Clara had developed a complicated relationship with organized religion that I didn't fully understand and didn't need to. Lozin performed the ceremony, which I suspect she invented on the spot, and which involved statements in English and ND that blended declarations of commitment with what I'm fairly certain were agricultural metaphors. Me served as witness. St. Francis attended uninvited and made commentary throughout. On the day of the ceremony, Clara wore a dress she'd made herself, not white, blue, the color of the desert sky at the exact moment before dawn when the darkness has retreated, but the light hasn't fully committed. She'd patched it nowhere. It was the first piece of clothing I'd seen her make that wasn't repaired, that was whole from the start. After the ceremony, I found her standing by the well. Our well. The spring well with its stone lining and wooden housing and the small green plants Lozin had seeded around it. "I'm not afraid anymore," she said. Of the future, of the empty. It's not empty. No, it's not." She reached into the well and brought up a handful of water, cold, clear from the deep rock. She held it in her cupped palms and looked at it, at this ordinary miracle, this water that had been there all along, waiting for someone to dig down far enough to find it. "What did your ledger say about today?" she asked. "I don't keep the ledger anymore." "I know, but if you did." I thought about it. I thought about debts, about observations, about things to remember. I thought about Nanton, who was gone, and Lozin, who was here, and me, who was growing, and Clara, who was standing beside me in a blue dress with water in her hands and no fear in her eyes. "If I did," I said, "it would say accounts balanced, ledger closed, no further entries required." She smiled, not the almost smile, not the foundation of a smile, not the structural preparation, the whole thing complete. The way a house looks when it's finished, not perfect, not without flaws, but standing, solid, designed for living in. She let the water fall back into the well. We walked back to the house together. I write this from the porch 3 years later. I don't know who I'm writing it for. Not the ledger is still in the trunk, untouched. A relic of the man I was when I arrived here with dust on my boots and debts in my pocket. Maybe I'm writing it for the version of me that rode up to that broken fence and cataloged its failures without seeing what it protected. Me is 10 now. She reads everything she can get her hands on and has opinions about subjects I didn't know existed. She started keeping her own notebook, not debts, she says, and not observations either. Stories. She writes stories about chickens with the names of saints who go on adventures. And the stories are strange and wonderful and occasionally feature a character named Mr. Eli, who is always dropping things on his own feet.